All right, we're going to start our unit here on biobasis of behavior. In this unit, we're going to be covering things like the neuron, the neural impulse, like we're doing in this lesson right here. We're also going to be learning a lot of the major structures of the brain and what they do, what their purpose is in behavior. We're going to be looking at heredity and genetics, and we're going to be looking at the endocrine system, which is our system of glands and hormones. So we're going to start at the basic unit, the neuron. We have to know what a neuron is before we can go any further, and a neuron is simply the cell that we find in the nervous system. Now the nervous system we're going to learn is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and it also does send messages through nerves to the rest of the body. So the system of nerves, the spinal cord, and the brain are all what make up the nervous system. And so we find these neurons in all of those different parts of our bodies. The purpose of neurons are to send and receive information, as well as to integrate information that it receives before it sends it back out. So it processes that information and makes decisions as to what we want to do with it. This is a diagram of the axon, and you will be required to know this diagram. You'll be required to know the different structures of the neuron and what they do. So that's what we're going to spend the rest of this lesson on, and how the neuron works itself. So the different parts of the neuron, the first one we're going to start with is the soma. The soma is the cell body of the neuron. It contains all of the other information that every other cell has in its structures. It processes the information that comes into it and then sends a message out to the rest of the neuron. The cell body is found here. The cell body is found here, and it contains the nucleus, as you can see there, but it also has all the other structures that you would find in any other cell of the body that you learn about in biology class. The second structure is dendrites. The dendrites are located out here, and they look like a tree. They look like the branches of a tree, and that's how we want to remember those dendrites. And the dendrites' responsibility is to bring information in from other neurons. So it brings that information in, and then it gets processed in the soma, and then it's going to send that information out through the third structure, which is called the axon. And this is the tail of the neuron. All of this down here is the axon. Now it's the purple piece that you can see underneath that yellow. You can see it in between the yellow. We're going to learn about what that yellow is in just a moment. But the axon itself is the purple part underneath that the yellow is surrounding. And that structure carries that information away from the rest of the neuron, and it's going to send it out into other neurons throughout the nervous system. The next structure we're going to look at is the myelin sheath, and that is that yellow structure I was telling you about. The myelin sheath is this fatty substance here, this structure here, and you can see how, this is a larger picture of it, you can see how it's folded over itself, and it makes a protective barrier around the axon. And we just have these little nodes, is what we're going to call these. They're nodes in between each piece of myelin sheath. Let's talk about the myelin sheath. It insulates the axon, and if you think about what insulation does, is it protects it, and it allows the impulse that's being sent to go faster than if it were unmyelinated. So it's going to speed up an impulse. It's made up of some glial cells, and glial is like glia is like a fatty type of a cell, and the specific cells, glial cells, that make up the myelin sheath are called Schwann cells. So those Schwann cells are like a glue. They're fat, it's fatty, and it protects that axon and the messages that are being sent. Some other parts. The axon terminals. Now, the axon terminals are out here. Now, remember, the tail of the neuron is called the axon. So the terminals are out here, and there are these little buttons here at the end of each one of these little axon terminals. Okay? They come out from the axon, and we also sometimes will call them terminal buttons. Now, terminal, if you think of it, it means end. So that's how you're going to remember this. Is at the end of the axon. We call the axon terminals. They're the little pads at the end, and they contain something called synaptic vesicles that we're going to see a picture of on another slide in just a moment. These synaptic vesicles hold the chemical messengers that send information, and those are called neurotransmitters. You've heard of neurotransmitters. If you've ever heard of serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, which I believe you learn about in your biology class. Those are examples of different neurotransmitters that we have running throughout our nervous system that do different things with our behavior. And those neurotransmitters are located in the synaptic vesicles, which are located inside the axon terminals. Let's talk about the synapse itself. Now we're going to start talking about the different exchange of information, how that's going to take place. We're still looking at structures in the neuron, but we're also going to start this process of how a neuron fires and what it does. So this is where the information exchange takes place, through those neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are going to be released from the axon terminal, which is located here. This is the axon terminal. These big circles here, the big one, that is your synaptic vesicle, and inside the little red circles are your neurotransmitters. The three parts of the synapse include the axon of the presynaptic neuron, or the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron. Now, presynaptic simply means it's before the synapse. It's at the beginning of the synapse, so pre meaning before, and it contains the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron, or the after synaptic neuron, and this is the synapse all right here. So you have two neurons communicating here, the axon of the presynaptic neuron, the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. And the third structure of the synapse is called the synaptic cleft. That is that gap, that space in between those two neurons where the actual exchange of communication takes place, the exchange of information, I should say, takes place. Just another picture of what this looks like. And you'll see I've included some videos in here. If you go into the actual, just the PowerPoint itself, you can watch these videos. I'm not going to take video time here to show those, but you can watch those on your time. We've talked about the structures. Now I want to talk about the neural impulse itself. The neural impulse is the messages that we think of being sent between neurons and throughout the nervous system. So what happens with a neural impulse is that neurotransmitters send those messages for a neuron to either fire or to stop firing. And they're controlled by, the neural impulse itself is controlled by positive and negative ions that are surrounding the axon. So this down here, the axon, is where the neural impulse is actually occurring. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the neural impulse taking place. Let me just go back for a second. Information is going to come in through synapses into the dendrite of this neuron here. This would be the postsynaptic neuron that's receiving a message. Then it's going to go into the cell body, or the soma, and that's where information is processed to make a decision whether or not we're going to stop firing now, or we're going to send an impulse to tell another neuron to fire or to stop firing. So these pluses and minuses that you see down here, these are your ions. And the ions that we're talking about are actually sodium and potassium ions. They're the positive ions. And then we have chloride, which is your negative ion that's in the middle right now. The first type of neural potential that I want to talk about is resting potential. This is the time when the neuron is not firing. So this is when it's electrically balanced, and I have balanced in quotes because it's not really balanced. There's not the same number of positive and negative ions on either side of the axon. This whole thing right here, by the way, this is the axon of the neuron right here with the positive ions on the outside and the negative ions on the inside. So electrical balance point, but really the neuron is always ready to fire, and it's always tense because there really are more positive ions on the outside than there are negative ions on the inside. But when we're in resting potential, what you need to know is that the inside of the axon is more negatively charged in relation to the outside. So more positive ions on the outside, more sodium and potassium on the outside. But it's always waiting for a signal, and it's always ready to fire. The action potential. Oh, and I failed to mention, I'm sorry, the resting potential is also called polarization. It's when the neuron or the axon is polarized. And I say that because when we get to here action potential, we call it depolarized, and you'll see both terms. In fact, I think a lot of times they like to use the term depolarization when they're trying to test you on the neuron itself. So the action potential, if resting potential is when the neuron is not firing, the action potential is what? When the neuron is firing. So the neuron actually fires, and here's how this takes place. What happens is as a message is being sent, as it's been processed in the soma, the ions on the outside of the axon make their way to the inside. And you can see through this little graphic here down at the bottom, you can see how that's happening. Watch the arrows as it goes across, the information comes in, and all of those positive ions are shifting to the inside, and the negatives are shifting to the outside. So when we talk about depolarization, the inside of the axon now becomes more positively charged, where in resting potential it was more negatively charged. So it's that exchange of the ions down the length of the axon. The sodium ions, that's what Na plus stands for, is sodium. The sodium ions actually rush in a myelinated neuron, okay? This picture here that I was just showing you, this is an unmyelinated neuron, okay? In this myelinated neuron, and this is why the information runs faster through a myelinated axon, is that the only place that the exchange of information is taking place is at these little nodes in between the bubbles of myelin sheath surrounding the axon. So what happens is the message actually hops down the axon, and it actually goes faster that way. So you can look here and you can see how the ions are rushing in here only, okay? And they would rush in, they just rushed in here, okay, beforehand. Now they're going to rush in down here, all right? And we call those, we call those little gaps in the myelin sheath, we call those nodes of Ranvier, because a guy named Ranvier found them. He discovered them, and he named them after himself, or someone named them after him. Okay, another part of the neural impulse is called the absolute refractory period. Now, the absolute refractory period is the minimum length of time between action potentials. What does that mean? It's the minimum length of time that has to take place before another neural impulse can be sent, before the neuron can fire again. So we're going to do something in class when you come back that I'm going to demonstrate the absolute refractory period to you. We're going to take a little field trip. But there is a gap of time. Once the neuron fires, it fires, but then it takes a little time to recharge, and it can't fire during that recharging time. It has this small little gap of time that it has to wait. So the axon needs to restabilize, and the sodium channels need to reopen for that neuron to fire again. So that's what's happening there, and I'll demonstrate that when you come back to class. The relative refractory period, another length of time. It's a very short period of time after absolute refractory, and the neuron can actually fire again, but it can't fire at the same intensity because all of those sodium channels have not had a chance to recharge, have not had a chance to close up and shift all of that information back to where it belongs into resting potential. The all or none law. This refers to when the neuron fires, and here's the deal. The neuron either fires or it doesn't. There's no in between. It's like you flush that toilet and it's gone. Whatever it is that you lost down the toilet, okay, if you dropped your ring in there or whatever, it's gone. Some things you're like, yeah, I want it to be gone, and that would be good, but the neuron either fires or it doesn't. There's no in between, and you can't stop it once it started. The intensity of the neural impulse doesn't matter. It's just the fact that it fires, and you can't back it up and you can't stop it. Another video you can watch if you'd like to about the action potential. The types of neurons that we have. The first type are called motor neurons. Now, anytime we hear the word motor, now I don't want you thinking of your car. I want you to think of movement, okay? Motor neurons, we're going to hear about motor nerves, motor whatever is going to mean movement. So motor neurons are going to be neurons that send information for the body to move in some way. A second type of neuron is called sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are going to bring information in from the outside of the body through our sense organs, and they're going to send that information to other neurons that are going to make decisions what we're going to do with it. So these are going to be the things that you see and hear and smell, and it's going to process that information, and then usually it's through motor neurons, something's going to be sent out telling the body to do something in response to those sensory neuron messages. The third type are called interneurons. These are found in the spinal cord, and interneurons are kind of like relay batons, if you will. They send messages between motor neurons and sensory neurons, and vice versa. So when information's coming in or going out, and we'll talk more about how that all works, how the information all gets sent to the brain and back out to the body. But when that information is being sent through the spinal cord, in order for motor and sensory neurons to communicate with each other, they need like a relay baton, and we call those interneurons to keep those messages going to where they need to go. The fourth type of neuron, and this is a new neuron that has just been discovered in the last several years, and they're called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are very interesting because they have to do with what we call observational learning. We watch someone else do something, and then we repeat that behavior. Now, there's a lot more to mirror neurons than just that, but for the sake of where we are right now, that's what I want you to know, is that mirror neurons help us to repeat behaviors that we see being performed. In other words, they mirror the behavior that we're seeing. And I am going to stop there and call it good for this lesson, and then I'll do the neurotransmitters in a different lesson. So jot down any questions that you have that aren't clear, that you want me to answer when you come back to class, and then we'll do that demonstration, and I'll do a little bit more explanation of that action potential and how that takes place. I'll draw a diagram on the board and things like that, and you'll have a better understanding of that. So hope you're doing well, and I will see you soon.